Hey guys, welcome back. My name is Austin from Awful Media, and today we're going to be creating the inventory class that will handle managing the actual inventory in our game. What we'll do is we'll create a C# script in our scripts folder. I'm going to call it inventory. I'm going to drop this onto, once it loads there, I'm going to drop it onto our inventory object in our scene. That way we can reference the item database no problem. I'm going to open this up in Visual Studio. Going to get rid of this stuff for now. I don't want it cluttering up my space. So I know I'm going to need a reference to the inventory panel itself. We know we'll need that. So we're going to do a game object. I'm going to call it inventory panel. We'll need that. I know we'll need a reference to the slot panel, the actual panel that's going to have the slots within the inventory panel. We'll need the actual prefab that we set up that is the slot itself. So we'll do inventory slot. And then we'll need a reference to the actual prefab that is the item. So game object, we'll call it inventory item. And that's going to be the actual UI stuff that we need. There's probably a couple more things that we'll get to in the future, but for now, I think that's what we'll need to get going. Now we'll need a list that represents the actual inventory. We're going to separate this into two lists. We're going to have the inventory that we work with in the back end, the actual back end representation. Then we're going to have the front end representation. It's going to be the slots that actually draw out onto the screen and move the items around and stuff like that. So we'll have the item inventory or the item list. Then we'll have the game object list. That'll make more sense here in a second, I believe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list. First of all, we have to get system.collections.generic. We need that namespace to be able to use the generic list we're going to be using. There's going to be a public list. This will be a list of type item. I will call this inventory. Oops. Well, let's see. Inventory. It'll be inventory.inventory. It's kind of weird, isn't it? So let's do items. Inventory.items. That makes more sense. I like that. Make it equal to a new list. List. There we go. The other list will be a public list game object. And this will be called slots. Is equal to a new list. And there we go. Let's go ahead and wire some of this stuff up. We're going to do that within start. So the inventory panel, we could do this. We could grab this by name. Since they're doing it in start, it's not that big of a deal. It only happens one time at the game load, so we could just wire it up that way. We could do a inventory panel. Inventory panel is equal to gameObject.find. We could find it by the name, so it would be, I think we call it inventory panel. And then we could also do slot panel. Now, slot panel is the child of inventory panel. I think it'd be more efficient to just grab the child of inventory panel. Maybe not, but we'll do it this way anyway. Inventory panel, or inventory panel dot transform dot find child. And we're going to pass it the name of the child we want, which is slot panel. And it's looking for a game object. Right now we have the transform, so we have to go to the game object component by doing that right there. And what that's doing, if I didn't explain it well enough, that's grabbing what we just grabbed, the game object inventory panel. It's looking through its children and finding one by the name of slot panel and grabbing that game object. So what that would do is go to the canvas. So we have inventory panel. It's going to go down and find the slot panel, and that's going to assign that to that field. So we're good to go with that. And now we have inventory slot and inventory item. Now these two items are prefabs that are not actually in the scene. So we could assign them in the inspector, or we could do like a resources.load kind of thing. But I think we'll just do that in the inspector just to keep it simple. So I'll make these public. So we can wire them up in the inspector in the old Unity way, you know. Let's go ahead and go back into Unity. And I'm going to go to my inventory object. And I have those two fields now. I'm going to go to my prefabs. Going to drop item onto item and slot onto slot. Okay. Looks good. And now one thing that I know I'm going to need is a way to determine how many slots I'm going to be creating. So we create a, making a mess right now, but we'll create a public int Call it slot amount. Well, we'll make, there's no reason for this to be public. I don't want to clutter up the inspector. We'll make that a private, and I will just call it slot. Ooh, I just slot out is equal to 20, probably. I don't know. All right, slot amount is equal to 20. Now we can use that to loop through 20 times and add that many slots to our inventory. Let's go ahead and do that real quick. We'll do a for int I is equal to 0. I is less than, let's see, slot amount. So we're going to go loop through, oops, slot amount. Loop through 20 times and do an increment, obviously. And now for each time we loop through, I want to add a slot to the slot panel. The first thing I would do is I would grab the slots list and I would add one to it by doing that right there. And we're going to add a game object to this. So we're going to instantiate, within that list, we're going to instantiate a slot item. So it'd be inventory slot. So it's going to add a blank inventory slot to that list at that point. So it's going to go 1, 2, 3, or 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 20. So we'll have 20 empty slots there. So now what I have to do is take that and make sure I set the parent of the inventory slot that we just created. Make sure I set that parent to be the slot panel. Because right now, when it creates it, it's going to create it just, you know, at the top of the hierarchy. It's not going to be the parent or the child of slot panel. It's going to be not inside the canvas. It's not going to render correctly. All kinds of issues. So what we have to do is we have to grab that slot. Now I could go through it like that, or I could assign it to a variable here and then access it that way. But for now, we'll just do it this way. No problem. So slots I, the one we're currently on, .transform .set parent. So this allows us to set the parent transform. So this would be, see, slot panel .transform. So now this slot that we just created will be the child of the slot panel. That's what we want, because we know if it's a child of the panel, it's going to follow the grid layout flow, and we'll be able to access it just like that in the future. So let's go back into Unity real quick, and let's see what problems we have. Cool. So, well, the problem is we create too many, and that's fine. Not an issue. I could just change this to 16. That's 4 less. Play that. And now we have an inventory with dynamically populated slots. Pretty cool. It's not something we just wired up in the inspector anymore. It's just it's working how we expect. All right, so for each one of these, though, we're adding the slot, but we're also not creating the inventory, right? So the inventory, the actual inventory, or the items itself, the item list, has no items in it. It has no count. There's nothing there. It's 0. So what we could do is we could do items.add. And we can just add empty items to this. So we can say new item. Now we know new item, what that will do is that will add an ID of -1. That's fine. That means that there's nothing there because we could not get -1 in any other way because none of our IDs go to -1. So we know if it's -1, it's an empty item, it's null. And that works for me. You could do it a different way. You could just not have that and just say, you know, if the title's empty or if the ID is... well, it'd be 0. If something is empty other than the ID, then you could check it that way and not have to say, you know, item ID is -1 or whatever. But this way we have items now. We have the same amount of items as we do slots. They're empty items, but they're still items. We can fill that in with stuff later on. Now what I want to do is create an add item method. Make this public. Add item. Now this is going to take a parameter that will be just an integer ID. So we're going to pass it the ID of the item we want to add to the inventory. No problem, no problem. So we have on item database a way to take the ID and grab the item that matches it. That's what we want to be able to do. So we've got that right there. And what we could do is just say item, an object of type item to add is equal to database. Did I not get database? Let's see. Oh, we do need a reference to database for sure. So we'll just say item database. Just call it database. And at start, we want to grab this component. So I'll do database is equal to get component item database. It's on the same object, so what we have to do is get component, and it will grab the item database component from the inventory object. Just to show you what that means, it will go to inventory. I'm on the same object, so I just get component, it grabs the item database because it's right there, and it just works. So now we can do item to add is equal to database dot fetch item by ID. Want to pass it the ID that we passed the add item method, and that will fill this in with the item that finds. So now we know what item we're trying to add. Now all we have to do is find a slot to add it to. So we have to find an empty slot. We need to know if there's an empty slot in the inventory. If there is, we will add this item to that slot. So for that, we'll just loop through each int I is equal to 0, I is less than. And I do use a lot of fors in places I could be using for eaches. It's just a habit of mine. So items.count, go through each item in the inventory and do I++. Now we have to check to see if it is an empty slot. And if it is, we'll add the item there. So if items I.id is equal to -1, and we know we just talked about that means that's not an item, that's an empty item. That's a null item. If that's the case, then let's add the item there. So what I could do is say items I is equal to item to add. So now the inventory itself has that item in that slot. Now let's create the physical representation of that in the inventory, the actual UI element that shows us that there's an item in that slot. To do that, I would create a game object. I would call this item object, and I'll make it equal to, let's instantiate the actual item prefab. So it'll be instantiating the item prefab. What did I call it? Inventory item. There it is. So we've created the item. We have to make sure now that this item goes to the correct slot. And the first thing to do is make sure we make this the child of the slot parent. So to do that, I would say item object, dot transform, dot set parent. Again, set it to the actual slot I dot transform. So what that's doing is saying, so the item object we just created, this will represent the item that we just added. So we want to set this parent to be the slot that corresponds to the slot in the inventory that we're adding this to. And since these are going to be one-to-one comparison, we can just say that is equal to slots I dot transform, and that'll be no problem. That'll add that to that transform, making this object the child of that. And as a result, what we should be able to do is just say item object to center this in that slot, because now it's the child. Dot transform dot position is equal to, let's see, we could do slots I dot position, or we could do maybe, let's see, like a vector 2.0. That'll give us 0, 0, and that should be all we need, considering it's relative to its parent. And if its parent is that slot, we put it at 0, 0 in the slot. It should be in the center, depending on your anchors, in the center of that slot. So then when we add something, it should do that for us. And what we want to do is actually change the source image of that object to be the item icon, but we don't have a way to get the item icon yet. So we'll do that here in a second. But for this, let's go ahead and see what we have. Oh, make sure I add an item though. Let's go to start here and say add item. I'll add item of 0, which will be steel gloves. But again, there's no item icon, so we won't be able to see that. Okay, so what it's doing is what I expected to do, because I did not break out of the loop once I found a slot. I just kept going and I said, ooh, a slot, add one to it. Ooh, a slot, add one to it. Ooh, a slot, add one to it. And it kept doing that over and over and over. So we have to tell it, after we found a slot, we're just adding one item. So after we find a slot, quit. You're done. Break out of that loop. You found what you're looking for. Move on. So that should just add one item to the inventory. And there it is. Obviously, the icon is not correct. Let me see what this is set up to be. not anything. So if we add this, say, to be that, then every time it adds it, it'll be a wooden sword or a bronze sword, or whatever that is. So that's cool, but we want to make sure we get the correct item icon. To do that, we'll go to our item class and we'll set up our constructor to work with that a bit better. I'm going to create a public sprite, and I want to call this Sprite. This get set. But we're not going to add this to one of the parameters of the constructor because we do not care about that. We don't need any more information. We have the slug right here. So what I can do is I can say when I create an item, I want to set this .sprite to be equal to the sprite by the name of the slug that we passed. That's one of the benefits of the slug, is we can just do it that way because we have it underscored. There's no spaces or anything like that. So we can go through the file system and find an item that matches that. And we can also use this to find like a 3D object that represents the item. So if you're playing a 3D game and you're going to have models of each item, you can do this and grab the slug and make sure the slug matches the prefab of the object that you would have in a 3D world. So you can do that the same way we're going to be doing the sprite. Pretty cool stuff. So what we'll do is we'll go through the resources folder, which is something in Unity that it's a folder that allows us to query it for certain items. So if I were to create a resources folder real quick in my assets, create folder, call this resources. Now whatever I put within this, I can go through the resources class and load an item based on its type. So I know I want to put my sprites within resources because we have to access that through the resources class. And we're going to go through resources, go through the sprites folder, go to items, and there's our items for the inventory. So let's go ahead and do that. Resources, not resolution, resources dot load. And now we're going to load, we can say we load the type of sprite. And what it wants right here is a path to that object. So I will say the path is in the resources folder. Then you're going to go through, what was it? I just said it, sprites, items, and it should be within there. And it should be one by the name of the slug. So we're going to give it the slug. Just like that. And we make sure this matches up. So we have steel gloves, we have the great stick. If we add that one, it'll match up as well. We'll see what happens. Okay, I did not actually wire that up in the add item method. That was silly of me. So what we have to do now is we have to set the source image of the item object to be the sprite of the inventory item in that slot. So I'll do item object dot, see, we got that. So we need the component that is, what is it, image? Yeah, I have to add the actual UI namespace here. So I'll go to using Unity engine.ui. It knows we're going to be using stuff from the UI namespace, which is image for sure. So grab that component off of that object, and we got to go to the actual sprite of that, and set it to be equal to see, item to add dot sprite. That is the sprite property we just added. It will be equal to the sprite of that item. And this is the sprite value of the image component. Let me show you real quick what that means. If I go to my prefabs and I go to item, the image component is that right there. The sprite itself is the actual image. It represents the graphic that draws on the screen. And there that is. So this should work like that. That should be no problem. Let's see what happens. Oh, there's an error. I better know what's happening actually. So the item database is not loading, I think, a theory here, is not loading before the actual inventory is. So that is causing us to fetch an item that does not exist yet, and it returns a null. So the simple issue with that is execution order. And with it, when it comes to mono behaviors that we're working with, like start, we don't really have much control over the way it's executed, except for within Unity when we can go to and modify the execution order. We can't control it within code really, though. We have to go to Maybe we can, I don't know how to though. Go to script execution order. I'm going to add inventory. Make sure we clear all this off here. Make sure database fires before inventory. Apply that. So it doesn't, you can just drag it around till it matches up. Make sure the database is constructed before we create the inventory. Click play. And now it works. So that was a simple issue. And everything seems to be working just fine. Now I want to add an item that is not that one, so we can see if it gets the actual correct icon. This should bring in the brown sword. Cool. So it does. So now we have these in here. That's pretty cool. And just to fix the way this looks, I want to set the name of the object to be the name of the actual item. And we should be probably setting the position before we do anything with it, so it doesn't, like the item's never off screen while it's loading something. You know, that'd be kind of silly. So I want to do item object dot name, so we can set the actual name of the object. This is the name you see in the inspector, and this is the name of the object. I can set it to be equal to item to add dot title. And what that should do is it should show us in the slot panel, each slot will have the name of the item that's in it. It's pretty cool. And, or we could, if we want to make it a bit easier, set the slot name to be equal to that as well. Or like the great stick slot, or slot is equal to the great stick. Something like that. You could do that and make it a bit easier to read in the actual inspector. It's up to you how you do that. I could debug.log just to show you that this is everything's working right. I could do items, grab the first one or the second one, which would be the great stick, and grab the title of it, and that should print out the name of that item. Cool. Keep in mind, guys, this series is only possible because of my Patreon campaign. If you want to see this series go beyond what we had planned, if you want to see it get done quicker, if you want to see it get done, if you want to see this inventory system, if you want the assets to this inventory system, you can become a patron on my Patreon campaign. There's a link in the description below. If you give me $4, if you pledge $4, you get the assets to this. You get the actual inventory asset itself once everything is done, and up from there you get different kind of support levels. It's a pretty cool system, so check it out. Awful Media on Patreon. In the next part, we will cover a simple stacking system. Now, this is not going to be anything robust yet, but it's going to cover how, like, say if you want to add an item that is stackable to the inventory, it's going to look through the inventory, find an item that matches that item, and increase the amount of that item you have by 1, and it's going to be a visual graphic that shows you how many you have, and then we can use that later on to be able to use items, and it would take one away and use the effect of it. And then we can set up a way where we can split the stack and drag and drop and stuff like that. So it's going to be a simple stacking system to start with, but if everything goes smoothly, we can extend in the future for sure. And that will be the next part. It's going to be a very, very cool thing to see. So stick around for that. If you want to see more, subscribe. Become a patron. Like this if you can't afford to pledge anything. I understand. Liking the video helps quite a bit. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think. My name is Austin, and I will see you next time.